All right, Mountaineer Nation, it's time to get serious. We are just a few weeks away from the 2025 West Virginia football preseason training camp commencing. We're about 6 weeks away from the start of the 2025 season with the Mountaineers hosting RMU at home in Morgantown. And we know very little about this team thanks to Big 12 Media Days last week in Frisco, Texas, in which there wasn't a preseason poll. West Virginia also didn't decide to publish any sort of rough draft of a two-deep. So beyond what you've heard all off-season from head coach Rich Rodriguez and press conferences and the players themselves, reading some preseason magazines like Phil Steele, or I got my Lindy's over here and Athlon, this team is still clouded in secrecy. There are so many oars. I say on this depth chart right now that you have more oars than a rowing regatta because there is so much that still needs to be figured out. But I promised you after I made that video last week about Big 12 Media Days, because at that point in time, with a depth chart being published, we would have something to kind of talk about, something to go off to talk about this team, this roster, and analyze. I said I'd come back. I'm going to do it in kind of two parts this week and then a video next week. First, I'm going to talk about the West Virginia offense for 2025. Next week, I'm going to talk about the defense for 2025, because I don't like to make very many preseason predictions. And I mean, people have been making predictions, I feel like, already for this season on paper since the schedule released back in February. I will do one of those because I know that, gets clicks and gets people talking and excited. And I have done that for the last two seasons now, right before, the buildup of week one, where we have our weekly pregame show videos that I do Thursday night before the Friday to give that to you. So for now, I just kind of want to give a big, broad overview, 40,000 look view on what to expect from this West Virginia offense this year. I want to talk a little bit more philosophically at the beginning, which I think will then kind of trigger into a discussion about those different position groups, and then talking about how I foresee them doing collectively as a whole offense at the beginning of the season through, and then we can kind of look big picture at by season's end. What should we expect statistically? Because the numbers usually tell the story. If you're one of the higher scoring teams in college football, there's a very high likelihood, a chance that you are going to have a positive record by the end of it, making a bowl game, maybe even contending for a conference championship, making the college football playoff, etc., etc. So let's talk first and foremost. I think the biggest difference philosophically for what we can expect from this 2025 team versus 2024 is tempo. Now, this is kind of like a dirty thing, because every time I try and compare, or bring up any sort of fun fact or statistic or anything about the Neil Brown era and his coaching on offense, usually has some sort of negative connotation or something that I didn't like. But in reality, I think we're going to, on the whole, see a lot of what we saw out of the 2023 West Virginia offense. And I'm going to kind of talk more about this in terms of run versus pass and what we can expect. But the biggest difference from last year to this year is going to be tempo. And if you've listened to the series from Jed Drenning and the Inside the Gun podcast, he's done a phenomenal job these last several weeks talking about the Rich Rodriguez system and kind of what all that goes into that. And I mean, if you're like me and you remember 2000 through 2001 through 2007, you remember the good times and the bad. I think there will still be, despite what head coach Rodriguez says about, I hope I'm a better coach today than I was yesterday or the week before or 20 years ago, I still think there will foundationally be a lot of the same from that era. And I mean, it's going to look, I think, similarly to that Neil Brown 2023 offense. The difference being the tempo, wanting to go fast, and not having so much pre-snap motion. This was something that really irked me during the Neil Brown era. Is you'd have two tight ends left up on one side who move across the offensive line to the right side. You'd have a wide receiver after them coming across the other way, move the back to the other side, finally snap the ball after using 30 to 35 seconds of play clock, get down, huddle up, and do it all over again with all that pre-snap motion. It just made for way too much. And I think just get set, base offense of what you're going to run. Similarly to like many teams in the Big 12 conferences, they like to use tempo, whereas West Virginia wanted to try and slow things down. But with that, what's interesting to me, digging through the numbers, when you're looking at the tempo versus with all that I just had to say there about how slow West Virginia was, West Virginia still averaged last year 69 plays per game. Think back, one of the greatest offenses in West Virginia football history, 2007, you would think to yourself, man, up tempo, 7 seconds from, when spot the ball and we're going full speed, full throttle, they averaged 69 plays per game. So what I think I've learned from that is, one, even though West Virginia was very revolutionary at that period of time, same with Oregon with Dennis Dixon in that era, same with Texas Tech in a similar, kind of air raid style, but trying to push the tempo in that same regard out of a spread set, is fast. The football at that period of time was still slower than it is today. That everybody is running some form of the spread read option with varying degrees worth of tempo, and now they're running the RPO game, so they're involving that run pass option. And if that's the one thing, now just 7 minutes in and I'm going to drop the hammer, for this video, is what I really want to see from West Virginia this year is out of Rich Rodriguez is how has he evolved? How has he diversified? He said it all this past year, and maybe it's not something necessarily that we get to see, full go in 2025, because as we've talked about ad nauseum since the offseason, 74 newcomers, playing all these different, transfer players who have 1 year's worth of eligibility. So maybe, the base install, doesn't get to phase 2, 3, 4, 5 in 2025. Maybe we'll just see phase 1, phase 2, and into phase 3. But I'm very curious to see, because we can't have spread read option run with the quarterback, spread read option run with the running back, bubble screen on third down. I know I'm going to say the words bubble screen, and I'm probably going to make some people tick out there like they got Tourette's or something, like, please don't say an old Rich Rodriguez bubble screen out there, but you get what I'm saying, like, out there. So digging into the plays, looking at what Jacksonville State this past year, probably the easiest team to compare because that's Rich's old team, 960 offensive plays, 66% run, 33% pass, and I think that's a lot. That's a lot. I think in 2005, West Virginia might have been as Pat White and Steve Slayton, both freshmen. West Virginia was up, I think maybe even over that, pushing closer to 70% run versus 30% pass. Kind of waned, to be a little bit more balanced. And I hope that's what West Virginia has, because I don't know if you can be that run heavy in today's Big 12, because, I'm looking at the pass yards per game statistic. That would have put Jacksonville State last year at 190 passing yards per game, 14th in the Big 12. Only ahead of Houston, UCF, and Kansas. They only had 189 completions for the entire season. Nico Marchiol and Garrett Green combined had 37 more. So, I just look at some of those numbers. I'm like, that's... Now, Jacksonville State was third in the country in rushing. They had a 1,600-yard, running back with 25 touchdowns in Trey Stewart. Tyler Huff ran for 1,300 yards and double-digit touchdowns. So, I'm totally fine with, we go back to 2023 when West Virginia was the leading rushing team amongst Power 4 members. That was awesome. Just a tick ahead of that R.J. Harvey-led UCF squad, and they were, trailing some schools in the G5, so it really didn't necessarily matter. But run heavy, what I'm expecting, with tempo versus the slowness of Neil Brown's philosophy, game planning, game script, and there's another number that I found very interesting. Tyler Huff, 7th in the country in passing yards per completion at 14 yards per game. So, makes me think that there's going to be a lot of boom or bust down the sideline go routes. We can think back to 2023, how well Devin Carter did on some of those, deep routes, long out routes to the sideline. Hudson Clement, same difference. So what West Virginia really is eventually going to need, I feel like, to emerge, this will, kind of put a pin in it or a sub point to talk about later when we talk about wide receivers, is they need one sort of vertical threat. We can remember back to the early to mid 2000s, Chris Henry, one of the best, top 5, top 10 wide receivers in West Virginia football history. He was that guy. Then after he went to the NFL, 3rd round pick, Brandon Miles became that guy in 2005, 2006. And once West Virginia got to 2007, you had Darius Raynaud kind of became West Virginia's all everything at wide receiver, but he wasn't really that kind of David Sills, Kevin White-esque burn him down the field, throw it up to him kind of a guy, but he could do everything over the short yardage, middle of the field, medium game. But then West Virginia was able to complement him with a Darrell Jallow as the second wide receiver. Jock Sanders was also a true freshman in 2007. Yeah, Wes Lyons, I think, was a young wide receiver on those teams. And, 6'8", kind of hoped that Wes Lyons would eventually become one of those guys you could just throw the ball up to in goal line situations, especially because of how tall he was, but never really kind of manifested the way that Miles and Henry's careers obviously did. So, West Virginia, I felt like in that 2007 season, think back to that South Florida game, that debacle down there on a Friday night kickoff, just the bubble screen game was relied on way too much. So it looks like, fast forward 17 years down the road, Jacksonville State, they were throwing the ball. They weren't throwing the ball a lot. 314 attempts in 14 games. That's, under 20 attempts per game. And you only completed 190. So think you're like getting somewhere in the ballpark of like 10 to 12 completions per game. That is very different than what we are accustomed to. But if, Jaheim White's going to be a 1,600-yard rusher, Nico Marchiol is going to run for 1,300 yards, I think you accept that if that comes along with wins. Can that translate to the Big 12? That's going to be the golden question. So now we've kind of talked about philosophically. West Virginia is going to run the ball a lot, 60% of the time. They're going to throw the ball deep down. When they do take shots, they're going to throw some, deeper passes. That's kind of what we saw out of Garrett Green, for the last 2 seasons. And kind of, if you've watched my program, I kind of beat the drum. I think West Virginia was really missing out on some golden opportunities, drag routes, in routes, slant routes over the middle, utilizing a Traylon Ray, a Hudson Clement, and their ability to, collect yards after the catch. So do we see that more? Or is that only really going to come out of the bubble screen game? Because that's really kind of the fundamental 3 plays out of the bubble screen, or the spread option read, zone read that Rodriguez deploys, is you're going to hit them with so I guess the 4th play really being, the pop pass down the field, predominantly off play action, the bubble screen, or the spread read option, give to the back or keep with the quarterback. And if that's it, if that's, again, phase 1 and that's all we see, but West Virginia is really lethal with it, then fine. And I think that is actually what we're going to see to start out the season, especially those first 2 games against RMU and against Ohio on the road. Sorry, blanked there completely. So I think now looking position by position, I think we kind of all understand. I know that Coach Rodriguez said he really felt comfortable playing 3 quarterbacks, and that's great. The more the merrier. Love to have them. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you got to play one. Who's going to be the one who first trots out on the field against RMU and takes the first snap? I don't know just yet. That is going to be determined in camp. I think anybody out there, in the media or YouTube is just kind of spitballing at this. And if you have like a, flag that you're going to plant and say like this guy is definitely going to be the quarterback, I don't believe it until game one. I don't believe it until, that first play out on the field and they trot out there. So it's going to be a battle, till the final decision by Coach Rod, either Nico Marchiol or Jalen Henderson. I think Max Brown, I watched a good video analyzed by Mountaineer Paul on Locked On West Virginia, Mountaineer Sports, Locked On West Virginia, talking about his ability, what he was able to do at Florida. Liked what I heard and what I saw out of that program. Think he's got a gun. Think he's a big guy who can take those kind of body blows like a Jarrett Brown kind of type. But I stick with the gunslinger. I stick with the 4-year veteran, the guy who's put in the work, put in the time, stayed loyal, and is going to give it his go. The only way I feel like Nico Marchiol gets beat out is if Jalen Henderson fits the system, executing better than Nico Marchiol is. And again, it might take into the first couple of games of the season to kind of get a feel for it, because there isn't a preseason like we have with the NFL. So at running back, Jaheim White I think is primed for a big year. I think him getting up to 190 pounds at his 5'7" frame is huge. I think that spells to me and should spell to Mountaineer Nation that he's ready to take on 200 plus, maybe 240 carries. If he can take on 20 carries per game, I think that can pay dividends for him, because averaging 5.7 yards per carry, which was down from what he had incredibly in 2023, still 6 yards per carry, 20 times a game, that's 120 yards times 12 games. That's a remarkable season, over 2,000 yards. I don't think we're necessarily going to see just yet or that, but it just goes to show he's put on weight. If he can keep on, if he can avoid the injury bug, nothing freak happening while retaining that speed and his lateral quickness that gave him the best, juke score of EA Sports' college football 26, or at least out of the Big 12 running backs, then man, I think he's primed for a huge year. It was huge to get him back for his junior season. I hope he tears it up. So then, Jalen Knighton, more than capable 1B to Jaheim White's 1A. I think they could, split time maybe somewhere in the ballpark of 75-25, because Rodriguez isn't going to deploy just one back. And then you're going to see Ty Edwards in short yardage situations. And Dior Hubbard really, I think, came into his own in the spring. So I don't think that he's just going to be, a guy on the sidelines waiting for guys ahead of him to get injured or anything like that. But I really think you could see those 4 backs. Now, man, can like a Sincere Bowers, Cannon Katzer break into the mold? I think they certainly have the speed. I think they have the ability, from what they showed at the previous level. Just maybe it'll take a year or so to kind of adjust to the Big 12 game, Big 12 competition, something like that. But it's not out of the realm of possibility that they could take carries, because that's just the case in the system. That's why you're seeing now 3 commitments for the fall 26 recruiting class, 3 running backs, all of different body types and skill sets. That's what Rodriguez wants in his system. Backs, they really lead the way for this program alongside mobile quarterbacks. But here's the thing. The quarterback and the running back aren't going to have anywhere to run if the offensive line isn't up to snuff. And I got to say, I'm very, very worried early on going into this season, because, I just have PTSD flashbacks of that game, I was at in 2021, Oklahoma State. At home, West Virginia, had beaten Iowa State at home that year. They were welcoming Oklahoma State, who was ranked, another Neil Brown ranked game opportunity, and West Virginia fell absolutely flat on its face. Didn't have any more than I think it was like 121 yards of total offense. I think they only scored 3 points for the day. Just absolutely were horrendous. And while many of the fans, including myself to a certain extent, blamed Jarrett Deggy, But the logical, non-emotional side of me knew it was the offensive line was horrendous, giving up sacks left and right, just couldn't block, kindergartners at a pillow fight. It was just bad. Now that was a young Zach Frazier on that team. West Virginia didn't have Doug Nestor yet. I think Wyatt Milam might have either was a high school senior at that point in time. So it was, finally in 2022, West Virginia has Frazier, Nestor on the right side, and Wyatt Milam at left tackle, that then they were able to build 22 really above average year, 2023 elite year, 2024 above average year. I felt like the offensive line last year was still pretty good, even though, Nestor had graduated and Zach Frazier had gone off to the NFL. You still had Wyatt Milam, and you still had guys across the lines in their fourth, fifth, and sixth years of eligibility. Now that's not the case. But you do have those guys who are older in their years, but don't have the kind of either playing experience coming off injury, where I think it really starts up front with a guy I felt like, when I was on with Mountaineer Paul on his show a couple of months ago, has that been that long already? Man, time flies in the summer. But when I was on that program, I thought one of the top 8 impact transfers for this year was Walter Young-Bear out of Tulsa. Just a mauler of what I saw on field, the kind of guy that you want to really, a Ryan Stanchek-X kind of guy on that left, maybe that left guard position that you just want to, run. That's who you want a 3rd and 1 situation, run behind, because he's going to maul the guy in front of him. So how he adjusts from whatever Tulsa's in, Conference USA or something like that, up to the Big 12, that's going to be the question. So, and I don't think West Virginia plays a D line that necessarily, scares me, in the first, few weeks of the season to start it out. So this offensive line is going to have to gel, but I kind of think it can start there with Walter Young-Bear at that left guard position. So if there's anybody on this offensive line that I feel most secure about, that's kind of who that I'm kind of putting my chips into the basket of. But then everywhere else, I feel like you can put an or on the depth chart as you're drawing it up. So I'm looking at mine right now that I keep an Excel spreadsheet for. Carson Lee or Nick Cray, a guy who was kind of like a returner who, if you listen to Neil Brown's press conferences over the last couple of years, sounds like was just ready to crack the starting lineup, just had some seniors above him. So I think Cray retaining him, not going to the portal, felt really good about. Understanding a little bit more about Tykees Crawford's story and from 2024 and not having played very much and kind of like, self-opting out at Arkansas. I mean, it's not like the end of the world, kind of thing. We saw that last year on the basketball court with Sincere Harris. But he was one of those guys that kind of stuck around. That stuck around through the spring, so might have has an edge, I would say, at least initially, on a Josh Isosa, a Malik Agbo, Mikael Clay, Donovan Haslam. Isosa, Agbo coming from SEC programs in Oklahoma and Texas respectively, so give them some props there, okay. Also really intrigued what I hear about Aiden Bissell. If he, Carson Lee, Nick Cray, Kimo Macaneole, and Walter Young-Bear are going to battle at some of those interior, thinking guard positions, or if Lee's going to start at center, but Landon Livingston getting the nod to get to go to Big 12 Media Day at least puts the idea in my head that he's going to initially start out there at the center position. And then a guy like Xavier Bosley, who had over 800 snaps 2 years ago at Jacksonville State for Coach Rod, comes in last year. We were thinking that he was going to battle, a sixth-year senior Nick Malone, who ended up having a great senior season. I felt like very unsung hero of last year's team in Nick Malone. So now is it Bosley's position to take? I think it's up there for the taking for him. So be very curious to see hear, read the reports, how the offensive line is gelling through fall camp. And then, of course, that's where my eyeballs are going to be on throughout that Robert Morris game. And, of course, the Ohio game. And then we'll just all have to see how it does whenever the backyard brawl happens on 9/13. Because, like the basis, the core, the foundation of an offense is the offensive line. And you have to be in Rodriguez's system. You got to be smart. You got to know who to block. You got to be athletic. You got to have endurance to be able to play at that type of speed. And whereas I think it's easier, like going back to that, what I talked about with Neil Brown and tempo, I think it's easier to go slower. Yeah, the skill position players have to figure out their motions and you still as an offensive lineman have to figure that out, but at least physically on you to be able to go out there and wanting to, set 7 seconds between when the previous play is done to the next time that it's spotted that you're snapping the ball. To be able to do that, you have to keep up with the pace. So in pass protection, run, and 60% of the time being run game, I'm very curious to see if these guys are up for the task. And I think that could be the difference, ultimately in, this could be a boom or bust season, is that offensive line. I know I don't want to get too radical now 26 minutes in here, and we're still talking on July 17th. But, West Virginia, I feel like, was very privileged these last 3 seasons with a pretty stable offensive line. Very veteran group. 2 guys that ended up going into the, being drafted in the NFL draft. I know Doug Nestor was picked up, had like an NFL contract. I don't know if Yates or Jaquay Hubbard are still playing professional football for this upcoming season. I don't think so. But that's what I mean. More than serviceable. And that's going to be, I feel like, the difference in how good this offense can be is because of that line. So then, looking at tight ends and wide receivers, going back to what I said in boom or bust plays, I had to look this up for myself because West Virginia adding all of these tight ends, and always it seems like that's kind of like the sexy topic to talk about. It's like, is West Virginia finally going to deploy a tight end? Short answer right here and now, and you can kind of quote me and put this out there, is no. I went back and looked this up. I looked through all the years that Rodriguez coached at West Virginia, then his Michigan time, then his Arizona time, then his UL Monroe, Old Miss. Well, no, I didn't look up those years because he wasn't head coach at that point in time, but then his Jacksonville State years. The most receptions in one season by a Rich Rodriguez head coach tight end was Bryce Wolma back at Arizona, and I think he had 28. So 28 catches on a season, I'm sorry, that's a little over 2 per game. No, the tight end is not going to be like a Brock Bowers, Kyle Pitts-esque type of, feature player in West Virginia's offense. The tight end player will be primarily used to block. There might be some packages that West Virginia deploys this Grayson Barnes from Northern Illinois, like his ability. Everybody is playing NCAA 2026 loves what Grayson Barnes is, like a Cole Taylor 2.0. I don't think we're going to get that. I think really Jacob Barrick is going to be the guy. Again, every video that I watched for Trey Stewart, scoring touchdowns for Jacksonville State, who was leading through on the blocks on the on the outside when he rushed outside, Jacob Barrick. So I think he is going to be the trustworthy, steady guy there at that tight end position who is going to predominantly be used 60% of the time as a blocker. Now, if they get into 2 tight end sets or, it's a longer, down and distance play that they want to get a tight end involved, I think have at it. I think have at Grayson Barnes. Maybe this Ryan Ward from North Carolina can do a little bit of both. I don't know necessarily why Greg Genross is still on this team, but he was apparently a pass-catching tight end first, so maybe he gets involved. But I don't think that we're going to see the kind of volume to the tight end position that fans are going to be like, woo, because there's now, 20 years worth of evidence that I've now just laid out to you of Rich Rodriguez head coach teams of involving the tight end into the offense, and from a pass game perspective, it's going to be primarily used as an additional blocker. So then at wide receiver, like I said, you need to establish some sort of deep threat. I think that guy's going to be Cam Vaughn. I've loved everything that I've seen on tape from Cam Vaughn. Hearing that he was last year a converted quarterback from what they recruited at high school. It's like, the opposite of a Pat White story, being recruited as a wide receiver to LSU, come play quarterback here. No, quarterback in high school, goes to Jack State, plays wide receiver. I think big enough at 6'2", 190, but he's going to go against bigger, stronger, more talented cornerbacks in the Big 12, while not the SEC. So I think there still is a level up from what was the Jacksonville State in the Sun Belt, Conference USA. Anyway, from Conference USA up to the Big 12, then to the SEC. So I don't think it's going to be that major of an adjustment that he can't do it. I really do think that Cam Vaughn is going to fit in nicely into that wide receiver one, deep threat possession, kind of receiver that you need to lead your team in targets, receptions, and yards, like a Hudson Clement left that hole of going to Illinois this past offseason. So 48 catches, 803 yards, and 5 touchdowns. I think he can definitely repeat that at West Virginia as their wide receiver number one. Wide receiver number two is a completely open ball game to me. I'm really I don't know what to think. I don't know what to feel, because is it going to also kind of mirror Vaughn on the opposite side, and you're looking for a deep threat? I think that West Virginia has added every type of kind of wide receiver that you can think of in the book this offseason. Now, I talked about the article that Chris Anderson from 247 Sports posted last week, saying that 4 Mountaineers, including wide receiver Jeff Weimer, still have to receive approval, waiver clearance from the NCAA to play this season. So with that kind of tentatively, I don't think I can spend too much time talking about Jeff Weimer right now. And what he's going to bring to the table. So, some deep threats that I'm really looking at. I really liked, what I read on out of high school, a higher rated 4-star recruit to North Carolina in the same class as Traylon Ray was Christian Hamilton. Now, a guy who I think kind of got caught between some other really highly competitive wide receivers, namely J.J. Jones, who we can remember, pushed off Beanie Bishop in that Duke's Mayo Bowl. And then after the game, Garrett Green was pretty much saying transfer to where your dad played, a legacy player, and spurned West Virginia twice and said, I don't need this. West Virginia went the other route with Justin Robinson. So I think Christian Hamilton can either be an impact receiver come 2026 at the latest, if he doesn't get his opportunities, just a redshirt sophomore, so he does have 3 years worth of eligibility still to use at West Virginia. So love to see him step up, kind of in that second wide receiver spot, and another outside player coming in is Justin Smith-Brown. Highly productive guy out of South Carolina State. He can fly. If Preston Fox is only going to necessarily be used on special teams in those returner positions, of which he is lethal, I feel like they're on kickoff and punt return, that's fine. But Justin Smith-Brown can also do that, so I like him there as that kind of two-way player. And I know I've also said about Rodney Gallagher, that could be a place that he could eventually, see do his most damage first. Now, Gallagher, a junior, I made a video about this, I think back in April, that this is his year to finally break out. Whether he's a 2, 3, 4 wide receiver doesn't matter to me. This is his moment to step up to the plate and be, the guy that he was prophesied as out of high school, kind of local guy, but over the border in Pennsylvania, out of Uniontown. Has loved the Mountaineers since he was a kid. Love what he's doing off the field for, kids out there, and starting a program for youth. So, biggest fan here for Rodney Gallagher this season. But is he a deep threat, kind of like a wide receiver that you would commit, in the same kind of a vein as a Kevin White or as a, David Sills? No, I don't think so. But I don't think he necessarily needs to be that. I think he just needs to be a slot receiver. But he's finally got to pass up Preston Fox on the depth chart at that position, which he hasn't been able to really fully do for 2 seasons. And now he has Orion Singleton Jr. coming in from Eastern Michigan, who, as I've mentioned a few times, had 8 catches for 80-some yards and a touchdown and tore up Jacksonville State when the 2 teams played last year. And that's why Rodriguez wanted to go get him out of the transfer portal. So then you got Jaden Bray representing West Virginia at Big 12 Media Days. Jaden Bray really tore West Virginia up in 2023 in Morgantown. We can remember that heartbreaker game on homecoming where he kind of spun out of 2 defenders, got to the sideline, scored a really highly skilled touchdown. But last year, the best thing that he did, I'm saying facetiously, is he caused that fumble against Penn State that, West Virginia was driving after it got a fumble off Drew Aller. Remember the controversial, clapping by Josiah Trotter or something that caused the fumble. Then the very next play or play after, Jaden Bray goes across the field on, I don't know if it was a counter or reverse or something like that, kind of got in the way of the snap of Garrett Green. West Virginia loses the ball, Penn State recovers. So missed out on capitalize on a turnover, and then Jaden Bray was pretty much hurt for the entire season. So he really desperately could use a bounce back last season's worth of college eligibility. So I've thrown out a whole bunch of names at you. Eventually, this is why I thought bringing in so many wide receivers. Now, again, granted, if you have the roster positions, fine. By all means, go ahead and use it, please. It doesn't hurt anything other than, what you're spending and rev share. And I don't know if the rev share is going to count toward this season, the salary cap. But if you can afford it, if you can afford to bring these wide receivers in, go out there and do it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's really going to come down to about 3 or 4. So, if I'm already chalking in Vaughn, if it's a competition between Bray, Gallagher, Fox, maybe Singleton, some of the other guys who are coming in from, Smith Brown, maybe a Ramper competes, or Jeff Weimer gets his waiver and needs it. So I don't know at this wide receiver position. So still a lot of unknowns, totality, overall, big picture. Looking at where West Virginia was in total offensive points per game this year, I'm not going to be very bullish and say that they outproduced that this year. Just because, you heard it from the horse's mouth himself about Rich Rodriguez, as it took Jacksonville State a little time to get things going, last season, and they suffered a few losses. So I'm looking, RMU. I think West Virginia totally has the talent to go out there and score big, and probably over 40. I think the second game against Ohio, though Ohio was a double-digit win team last year, suffered a lot of losses, new head coach. A lot was poached to the transfer portal, but, on the road, crazy atmosphere that they're going to try and create there in Athens, Ohio, in a really small stadium that I don't even know if West Virginia fans are going to be able to get tickets into that stadium because there are so few to be able to have. But could that be, a road contest one in which, is a closer than, probably would be liked victory, somewhere in the ballpark of a 28-17 kind of thing. And then who knows with Pitt? I mean, we remember that game 2 years ago in Morgantown was 17-6. So then, Kansas on the road. Utah is going to be a really tough defense at home. On the road at BYU on a Friday night. And we know how those sober Mormons can be absolutely crazy and chaotic, especially their students. I think they can score heavily on UCF, on Houston, Colorado. But then, at the very end of the year, in a tough road game at Arizona State, home game against Texas Tech, who may, with both of those last 2 opponents, may have implications for a Big 12 championship game on the line. I think that's with the schedule, the newness, to go out there and say that West Virginia is going to score 40 points per game like they did in 2007 or some of these elite offenses that we can think of in recent memory. I think if they can average somewhere around 30 points per game, I think that'd be fantastic. I really do, because I think the defense is going to be better too. And while tempo, more possessions, more play, maybe even more plays, somewhere, if they can get upwards of over 70 per game, I think that can eventually, by the aggregate, score more points on average. But I think just to be safe right now here in July, I'm thinking somewhere in that ballpark of around 30 points per game can be manageable. Is West Virginia going to run 251 yards or a game on the ground like Jacksonville State did a year ago? Whew, that's really tough to say. 251 yards. When I looked at the statistics for what West Virginia did in 2023, when they were still the number one leading, rushing team out of the Power Four, they were still at only 229 yards per game. So while I believe Jaheim White's going to set the world on fire, while I think that teams are underrating Nico Marchiol's rushing ability, might not be the fastest, but neither was Tyler Huff apparently, and he rushed for 1,300 yards. Like, I don't know if I can just be that bullish yet. Again, given some of the defenses West Virginia's played, and especially the big question mark around the offensive line. And then, in the passing game, 190 yards per game. Like, take a look back at what West Virginia did against, I think, really the prototype game, if you want to call it that, or optimally. And I know that West Virginia had a different system kind of this game with Nico Marchiol at quarterback, which we'll have to see how much they do of this year, throwing to the backs, out of the backfield, toward the sidelines, just working kind of a whole bunch of different pass catchers in that game. Was Arizona on the road. Marchiol was incredibly efficient in that game, 18 for 22, so that's right around, again, if West Virginia is going to throw somewhere in the ballpark of, around 20 passes per game, or just a tick above, that's definitely a higher completion percentage than 60% of what Huff had a year ago. 198 yards in that contest. How many different wide receivers did he hit? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different receivers in that contest. C.J. Donaldson, Jalen Anderson, and Jaheim White. So like I said, throwing out of the backfield to the backs, which we could see, I think somewhere in the ballpark of around 190 to maybe like 220 yards per game. And that's a good day. That's a good day by a West Virginia quarterback if you're going to run 60% of the time. And then you're just going to have to be efficient as best you can on those points and times in the game when you do choose to go deep. Don't turn the ball over. That's a subtopic that we can talk about as the season goes along. How does West Virginia go on turnovers? Because, as we witnessed so many times throughout the Rich Rodriguez era, turnovers was just West Virginia shooting itself in the foot and costing West Virginia when it really needed to win against a ranked opponent. So I've given you a lot of food for thought here, while not being necessarily definitive on too many players within this offense, but I think I kind of gave you a good picture of what we can expect early on and maybe throughout the entire season. Big picture, schematically, philosophically, how, especially with the tempo, still the spread read option offense that we know from Rich Rodriguez, but I think it will be better. I think it will be better than what we saw in 2024. Even with all that, the potential pitfalls that can happen because of this offensive line, it's because of the volume of players, y'all. That's what I think. That if there is they're struggling at any point in time. So that's why some of these games might feel a little bit clunky, or, just like, whoa, it's just interchangeable widgets out there. Is that, let's say, Malik Agbo gets the start at left tackle. If Malik Agbo is just not performing up to snuff, he's gonna have a short leash. They're gonna move on to somebody else at that tackle position, or again, if it's just not, it's like trying to find a starting five, like the right starting five combination for different segments in basketball. So that's what ultimately Rodriguez and Jack Bicknell Jr. are going to have to figure out in kind of in tandem with the backs coaches and the backs quarterback and running back to make this this rush game go. And I think once Jaheim White didn't go through the spring, Interesting to get him back involved. Jalen Knighton wasn't there in the spring. Cannon Katzer, Sincere Bowers. It was pretty much the Dior Hubbard show at that point in time. So, I think he's a little bit further along. So that's, great for him. But that's really, I think, the base of what needs to establish first and what will in August. So, love to know your thoughts, good, bad, or indifferent. If you've liked this video, please like it so more Mountaineer fans can see it across YouTube. Love to have you a subscriber to my channel as well. If you're hearing me for the first time, love to hear just leave a comment for me and tell your friends, tell your family, tell your dog that I do this each and every week. Have a lot of fun doing it. Hail West Virginia, let's go, and spot the ball.